Imagine a man whose very presence commanded attention, not for his deeds, but for the extraordinary physical stature that set him apart from everyone around him. Ro Jose Florencio, later known as Pataseka, was born into a world defined by oppression and hardship in 19th century Brazil. From the moment of his birth, life on the plantations was harsh, cruel, and unforgiving. But Pataseka was marked by something unique. His towering height and immense strength made him both remarkable and, tragically, a target for exploitation. In a society where human lives were measured by labor and productivity, his physical gifts were not celebrated, they were commodified. Pataseka's story begins in Sorocaba, a town in São Paulo state, where the rhythms of plantation life dictated the fate of thousands of enslaved men and women. The work was brutal, the days long, and survival was a constant struggle. Most men faced backbreaking labor in the sugarcane fields or the coffee plantations, enduring sun, sweat, and punishment. But Pataseka's life, while spared the most grueling tasks, was shaped by a far more insidious form of control. You see, Pataseka was not assigned to the fields or to domestic work. Instead, he was selected for a role that stripped him of personal freedom in a deeply intimate way. He was forced to father children to sustain the plantation's labor force. Over his lifetime, he would sire over 200 children, each birth calculated by slaveholders as a way to maintain productivity and profit. The human cost of this was unimaginable. Pataseka's own identity, relationships, and opportunities for fatherhood were erased, replaced with a role that treated him as a tool rather than a man. Yet, within this story of exploitation, there is a powerful narrative of resilience. Pataseka's life provides a window into a system that manipulated bodies and lives, a system that attempted to turn reproduction into a form of economic strategy. His experiences are a stark reminder of the extreme lengths to which slavery reached, extending beyond the fields and into the most personal aspects of human existence. As we dive into Pataseka's story, we will uncover not just the cruelty of the system, but also the human endurance that survived within it. We will explore the lives of those he fathered, the women who bore children under coercion, and the plantation structure that forced a man to become an instrument of labor through his very bloodline. If this story intrigues you, and you want to learn more about untold narratives of history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us uncover stories that history tried to erase, bringing voices like Pataseka's back into the light. Every view, share, and subscription ensures that these lessons and legacies are remembered and honored, allowing us to confront the past with honesty and empathy. Pataseka's life is more than just a tale of survival, it is a lens into the resilience of humanity in the face of unimaginable oppression. Stay with us as we explore the full story of a man whose strength was both a gift and a burden, and whose legacy still echoes through generations today. As Pataseka grew into adulthood, the very qualities that had once set him apart became the reason his life was reshaped in ways he could neither control nor escape. His towering height and formidable strength, which might have been admired in any other context, were seized upon by those who viewed enslaved people not as human beings but as assets to be exploited. On the plantations of 19th century Brazil, where sugar cane stretched endlessly under the blazing sun and coffee and cotton demanded ceaseless labor, the enslaved population was the lifeblood of the economy. Yet it was also a finite resource, increasingly difficult to replenish as the transatlantic slave trade waned. It was within this system of calculated necessity and relentless cruelty that Pataseka's unique role emerged, a role that removed him entirely from the fields yet placed upon him an obligation that was both intimate and inescapable, a burden that would define the rest of his life. Rather than wielding a hoe in the scorching fields or tending to livestock under the ever-watchful eyes of overseers, Pataseka was selected to father children, a living instrument in the plantation's strategy to sustain its labor force. His body, already extraordinary, became a tool for a grim arithmetic of survival and profit. The plantation owners, guided by both superstition and a ruthless understanding of genetics and strength, believed that his stature and health would produce offspring capable of enduring the same punishing work that others could not survive. Women, already confined and controlled by the system, were chosen and paired with him under strict orders from the master, their consent rendered irrelevant by the weight of property and profit. Each child he sired was not a moment of joy or a continuation of family in the natural sense, but rather a calculated reinforcement of the plantation's workforce, a new laborer produced without ships, purchase, or negotiation, born into bondage from the moment they entered the world. The environment in which this arrangement unfolded was as methodical as it was cruel. Pataseka's own health and vitality were monitored with meticulous care, not out of concern for his well-being, but to ensure that the plantation's investment in human reproduction yielded the highest possible returns. He was fed and tended to, his strength preserved, and he was spared the back-breaking fieldwork that felled so many of his peers. Yet these were privileges hollow in their nature, for every advantage came at the cost of autonomy and humanity. His life became a continuous cycle of imposed fatherhood, each pairing arranged by the master to maximize output and each birth tracked as carefully as the harvest of sugarcane or coffee beans. He lived within the strange contradiction of relative safety and profound exploitation. Longer life and better physical care came only because his body was made to serve as a vessel for furthering the plantation's economic objectives. Meanwhile, the women who bore his children faced a life of relentless demand. Their bodies pushed to the limit of fertility while their personal desires, relationships, and autonomy were ignored entirely. Pregnancy and childbirth were treated as labor tasks, their outcomes recorded and valued in the same way crops were measured for weight and quality. Those who produced many children might receive marginally lighter workloads or temporary reprieve, yet the overwhelming experience remained one of exhaustion, pain, and deprivation, with little to no recognition of their own personhood. For Pataseka, this meant not only witnessing the suffering of the women forced to bear his children but also enduring the profound isolation of fatherhood without kinship, as the children were scattered, sold, or absorbed into the broader machinery of slavery, never forming bonds with the man who had sired them. The sheer scale of Pataseka's reproductive life is almost unimaginable. Over the course of decades, he fathered more than 200 children, each one a testament to the plantation's unyielding drive to convert human bodies into labor and profit. Yet the story is not merely one of numbers. It is a narrative of human endurance under relentless control, of a man whose own life, identity, and relationships were subsumed entirely by the needs of a system that viewed people as commodities. Despite the conditional privileges he held better nourishment, relative mobility, and protection from the harshest physical labor. Pataseka's existence was defined by the loss of personal freedom and the impossibility of genuine connection. He was a father in name only, a biological progenitor without the authority, recognition, or ability to nurture his children. This structure of exploitation reveals the disturbing logic of slavery in Brazil during this period. With the decline of the African slave trade, plantation owners faced a labor crisis that they addressed not by altering their economic model, but by turning inward, creating a controlled system of human reproduction. Men like Pataseka were singled out for their physical traits, while women were chosen for their fertility, and both were subjected to arrangements that served the plantation above all else. Height, strength, and health were carefully observed and preserved, and every child born was immediately assimilated into the cycle of labor, treated as a future worker rather than as a human being with a right to family or choice. The plantation thus became a self-sustaining system of production, with Pataseka as a central, though unwilling, participant. Yet, amid this grim reality, Pataseka's life also demonstrates the limits of oppression in extinguishing human resilience. Even as he was reduced to a function, stripped of ordinary fatherhood and intimate relationships, his survival through decades of forced reproductive labor was itself remarkable, revealing a persistence of spirit and bodily endurance under conditions designed to exploit and control him completely. The children he fathered carried forward his physical legacy, even if the bonds of family were denied, and the plantation's calculations could not erase the traces of life that persisted despite the system's intentions. Pataseka's existence exemplifies the brutal efficiency of a society that commodified human life while also offering a haunting reminder of the personal cost borne by those who were caught within it, a narrative of survival, exploitation, and the deeply human consequences of slavery. Life on the Brazilian plantations was a world meticulously engineered to extract labor from every human body while erasing the basic human experiences of love, family, and choice. And nowhere was this more painfully clear than in the way men, women, and children were treated as property rather than people. For Pataseka, his exceptional height and strength had marked him early on as different. But this distinction did not grant him freedom or dignity. Instead, it consigned him to a role that was deeply intimate yet entirely controlled, turning the very essence of life and reproduction into a mechanism of profit. Women were subjected to relentless cycles of pregnancy, their bodies monitored and managed with the same precision as the crops that surrounded them. And the children born from these unions were not embraced as sons or daughters but catalogued as assets, each one representing an extension of the plantation's workforce and a continuation of the master's economic plan. The bonds that might have existed between parents and children were systematically dismantled, ensuring that attachment could not interfere with the cold calculus of labor and profit. And Pataseka's own sense of fatherhood was stripped away, leaving him as a living instrument whose contributions were measured not in care or nurture, but in the number of lives he produced. The women who shared the plantation with Pataseka experienced a life of near constant demands, their reproductive labor intertwined with their work in the fields, kitchens, and households, a double burden that left little room for rest, recovery, personal agency. Each pregnancy was a requirement imposed by an authority that viewed human bodies solely as tools, and the outcomes, whether a child survived or perished, were recorded as if cataloging livestock, rather than acknowledging the joys and sorrows of human life. The children who were born were immediately absorbed into the system, some remaining on the estate to labor from a young age, others sold to distant plantations, severing any possibility of familial bonds and reinforcing a social order in which intimacy and personal relationships were secondary to control and efficiency. In this environment, Pataseka's experience as a father was both remarkable in scale and profoundly tragic. He fathered over 200 children, yet the majority were strangers to him, scattered across estates, their lives shaped not by connection or care but by the priorities of a system designed to extract maximum utility from human beings. The mechanics of slavery on these plantations revealed a disturbing logic in which human life was continuously commodified, and the personal and intimate aspects of existence were subordinated to the demands of labor. Men and women were selected, paired, and managed according to traits thought to optimize productivity, with physical strength, height, and perceived fertility determining roles and responsibilities. Pataseka's stature, which might have been celebrated elsewhere as a gift, became the foundation for a life of exploitation, and the women assigned to bear his children had their identities defined by their reproductive capacity rather than their individuality. The plantation operated with a precision that was chilling. Each child born represented a tangible benefit to the master, a new worker who could sustain the economy of the estate without additional purchase, shipment, or negotiation. The lives of those enslaved were transformed into a continuous cycle of production, and every personal relationship, every natural bond, was subordinated to the imperatives of control and profit. Even as Pataseka navigated this life of coercion, there were moments of stark contrast between the conditional privileges he received and the absence of real autonomy. He was spared the backbreaking toil that felled so many men in the fields, given adequate nutrition, and afforded medical attention when necessary. Yet these privileges were inseparable from the role that bound him to an endless cycle of reproductive labor. The care he received was not a reflection of humanity or compassion, but a means of ensuring that his body remained capable of producing the labor force that sustained the plantation's operations. In parallel, the women bore the relentless consequences of pregnancy, childbirth, and separation from their children, their labor and reproductive output monitored, measured, and valued as critical to the estate's profitability. In this way, the plantation became a system that converted love, family, and identity into commodities, and Pataseka's life illustrates the profound human cost of such arrangements. The children who emerged from this system were caught in its unyielding grip from birth. Their earliest experiences were defined not by familial affection but by labor, obedience, and survival. Infants and young children were kept close to their mothers only until they could begin contributing to the workforce, and the threat of separation was constant, whether through sales to other estates or relocation within the property. Bonds between siblings, parents, and communities were deliberately disrupted, ensuring that loyalty and emotional attachment did not interfere with the plantation's control. For Pataseka, this meant that the hundreds of children he fathered carried his blood, but not his presence. They were living legacies shaped by survival under oppression, yet largely disconnected from the man whose existence had been harnessed to serve the plantation's demands. The scale of his reproductive life was staggering, but it was a measure of exploitation rather than connection, a testament to the ways in which slavery penetrated the most intimate aspects of human existence. As decades passed, the plantation system continued to enforce its logic with relentless efficiency. Yet within it, fragments of resistance and identity persisted. Enslaved communities found ways to preserve culture, memory, and small acts of autonomy, from songs and spiritual practices to moments of solidarity and shared knowledge. For Pataseka, these glimpses of humanity existed alongside the enduring reality of his imposed role. He lived in the liminal space between survival and dehumanization, experiencing conditional privileges while simultaneously embodying a strategy that erased his personhood. His story is not simply one of suffering but also of resilience, reflecting the strength required to endure a life in which every aspect of family, intimacy, and identity was controlled by the imperatives of profit and labor. Pataseka's experience reveals the calculated cruelty of a system that treated men, women, and children as property. It underscores how deeply slavery intruded into personal and familial life, transforming childbirth into a labor requirement, erasing parenthood, and redefining children as assets rather than family. The story of his life is both a narrative of exploitation and a testament to the endurance of those who survived within such a system, offering a vivid and sobering lens through which to understand the human costs of slavery and the ways in which its logic sought to control the very essence of human relationships. Pataseka's life was defined by a paradox that starkly illustrated the cruelty and complexity of the plantation system in 19th-century Brazil, a world in which survival came at the price of humanity and every form of personal freedom was subject to the whims of others. unlike many enslaved men whose days began before sunrise and ended long after sunset in the punishing heat of the sugarcane fields. Pataseka's extraordinary height, strength, and perceived fertility granted him certain privileges. Yet these advantages were inextricably tied to the very role that denied him autonomy. He was provided with adequate food, a level of medical attention that ensured his body remained capable of reproducing the labor force, and a degree of mobility that allowed him to travel between plantations, tend to animals, or carry messages. On the surface, these conditions might have seemed enviable, even luxurious when compared to the grueling labor endured by other enslaved individuals. But the reality was far from freedom. Every privilege was conditional, carefully measured, and entirely dependent on his continued compliance with the demands imposed by the plantation owners. From an early age, Pataseka's life was regimented, each day structured not by his desires or personal ambitions but by the economic calculations of his master. His interactions, movements, and even the most intimate aspects of his existence were orchestrated to maximize output, and his relationships were arranged to serve the plantation's objective of producing a new generation of laborers. Women were paired with him not out of choice or affection, but because their physical attributes and reproductive capacity aligned with the master's goals. And the children resulting from these unions were immediately classified as property, a tangible asset whose value was measured in labor potential rather than familial connection. The intimacy of human relationships, which elsewhere might nurture love, identity, and community, was systematically replaced with a transactional model in which each individual's worth was defined by their contribution to the plantation economy. Pataseka, though spared the physically punishing fieldwork that claimed so many lives, bore the invisible chains of coercion, his body a tool for reproduction and his identity overshadowed by the function he had been forced to fulfill. The conditional privileges he enjoyed: food, medical care, mobility came with a profound cost, the very features that secured his relatively better treatment. His strength, stamina, and health were the reasons for his exploitation, and every meal, every medical intervention, every moment of freedom to move about the plantation was contingent on his compliance with a life that denied him agency. He was not allowed to form genuine romantic relationships, not permitted to nurture children in the way a father might, and never afforded the dignity of making personal choices about his own existence. Even his encounters with the broader community were mediated by his role as a breeder. His presence outside the immediate plantation space is always shadowed by expectation and surveillance. In essence, Pataseka existed within a gilded cage. He had access to resources that preserved his physical survival but lacked the most essential qualities that define human life: autonomy, connection, and self-determination. For the women who were paired with him, the conditional nature of privilege operated in reverse. Their bodies were monitored, their reproductive capacity scrutinized, and their labor extended across multiple domains, from tending fields to bearing children who would serve the plantation's future needs. Any perceived failure to produce offspring was punished, and even compliance offered no true security, as children could be sold away, erasing maternal bonds and reinforcing the absolute authority of the plantation master. For Pataseka, witnessing the consequences of this system compounded the tragedy of his role. He was a father in the most literal sense, yet he was denied the emotional and social experiences that make fatherhood meaningful. Watching his children grow into a world that treated them as instruments rather than family, the lives of his offspring were fragmented, dispersed across estates, and largely unknown to him. And yet his survival and the relative ease of his daily existence depended upon this very disconnection. The mobility he enjoyed, a rare freedom among enslaved men, was not freedom in the human sense, but a strategic allowance to maintain his utility, traveling between properties, overseeing certain tasks, and being seen by others as a capable, strong figure served the plantation's larger economic plan, reinforcing the perception of privilege while ensuring the continuation of his coerced role. His physical well-being was meticulously maintained, but each intervention by caretakers, each allocation of resources, was driven by the cold logic of investment. A healthy, capable Pataseka could father more children, who in turn would become future laborers, sustaining the plantation without additional purchase of enslaved individuals. In this sense, every aspect of his existence was instrumentalized, a constant reminder that privilege devoid of autonomy is a form of bondage disguised as advantage. The psychological weight of these conditions cannot be overstated. Pataseka navigated a life in which survival, mobility, and physical health were guaranteed. Yet every intimate choice, every potential bond of friendship, partnership, or parenthood was controlled by an economic system that valued profit above personhood. His role stripped him of normal human connections, leaving a profound sense of isolation that accompanied even the rarest glimpses of autonomy. He was simultaneously elevated above the average laborer and reduced below the level of a fully realized human being, existing in a liminal space where his value was acknowledged only insofar as it served the goals of the plantation, and where his very identity was co-opted into a system designed to erase individuality. Pataseka's life stands as a testament to the insidious ways in which slavery exploited both body and spirit, demonstrating that the preservation of physical well-being cannot substitute for freedom. His story shows that privileges that appear generous in comparison to suffering can mask profound control, and that autonomy, genuine relationships, and the right to parent one's own children are essential components of human dignity. The conditional privileges he experienced were inseparable from exploitation, and his existence reminds us that freedom is not merely the absence of physical labor or the presence of resources, but the ability to live one's life with agency, connection, and self-determination intact. In reflecting on Pataseka's experience, one sees the deep complexity of survival under oppression, the painful cost of conditional favor, and the resilience required to endure a life where even privileges are instruments of control. Pataseka's life left a legacy both vast and profoundly fragmented, illustrating the far-reaching consequences of a system designed to dehumanize and control every aspect of human existence. Though hundreds of children were born from the unions he was compelled to participate in, the concept of family, of genuine connection, was systematically stripped away, leaving a lineage defined by blood but void of the ties that give meaning to parenthood and kinship. His descendants, scattered across Sao Paulo and beyond, carry his genetic imprint. Yet most grew up without knowledge of their father, or even awareness of the many siblings who shared their blood. The plantations operated on an economic logic that deliberately severed familial bonds, understanding that attachment could inspire resistance, rebellion, or the assertion of personal rights that might challenge the authority of the master. In this way, Pataseka's story exemplifies the insidious mechanisms of slavery, where identity, relationships, and memory were subordinated to profit and productivity, and where the natural bonds of parent and child were transformed into instruments of control. From the moment a child was born on the plantation, their existence was defined not by love, nurture, or belonging, but by their immediate and future utility to the estate. Children of Pataseka and the women forced to bear his offspring were recorded as assets, their value measured by their potential labor output or, in some cases, their marketability for sale to other plantations. Families were deliberately disrupted, with infants and young children sold away to distant estates, ensuring that no emotional attachment could undermine the systematic exploitation of the enslaved population. Fathers, mothers, and siblings were denied the ability to form lasting bonds, a deliberate strategy designed to reinforce the plantation's control and suppress any possibility of collective resistance. For Pataseka, the weight of this reality was both personal and symbolic. He had sired hundreds of children, yet he could claim none of them as family in the ordinary sense. And he was denied the emotional rewards and responsibilities that accompany parenthood, leaving him a witness to the very structure of separation that slavery relied upon. The breadth of his legacy, though remarkable in scale, underscores the cruelty of the institution that created it. Oral histories and genealogical research in certain districts of Sao Paulo reveal that as much as 30% of the population in some areas can trace ancestry to him, a testament to both his prolific role and the enduring impact of the forced reproductive strategies employed by plantation owners. Yet this genetic footprint, while extensive, cannot substitute for the human connections that were intentionally erased. His descendants carry a piece of his life, his strength, and his endurance, but they inherit these markers without the guidance, care, or shared experience of the father who brought them into the world. The severing of family lines underlines the profound psychological and social cost of slavery. Even when life continued and survival was possible, the ability to cultivate meaningful relationships and a coherent identity was denied. In examining Pataseka's story, one sees the broader strategies of plantation economics intertwined with deeply entrenched social control. Slavery in Brazil, as elsewhere in the Americas, was not only a system of forced labor, but also a system designed to dismantle natural human structures. Manipulating reproduction, kinship, and lineage to serve profit. Men and women were valued not as individuals with histories, aspirations, and emotions, but as components in a larger machinery where each birth, each laborer, and each transaction was calculated to maximize gain. For Pataseka, the consequences were immediate and personal. He was a father in the biological sense, yet denied every aspect of emotional fatherhood. A figure of both continuity and erasure whose presence in the lives of his children was largely absent. His story, preserved through oral history, scattered records, and the living descendants who carry his blood, highlights the deliberate destruction of family, the erasure of identity, and the ways in which slavery reshaped the very fabric of society. The severing of kinship lines also left enduring cultural impacts. Children growing up without knowledge of their parents or siblings were forced to navigate a world where community ties were fragmented, where trust and belonging were constantly under threat, and where the social cohesion necessary for resistance or collective self-preservation was undermined by design. Pataseka's situation amplifies this reality, as he not only endured the personal deprivation of fatherhood, but also participated in a system that replicated this deprivation across generations. Each child he fathered, while a biological continuation of his existence, became part of a network of labor that perpetuated the plantation's control, a web in which familial bonds were subordinate to economic calculation. The psychological toll of such fragmentation cannot be overstated. Both parent and child existed in parallel realities, connected by blood but divided by circumstance, ownership, and social engineering. Even as Pataseka survived into old age and experienced the eventual abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888, the structural damage inflicted upon his family lines remained largely unrepairable. While he gained freedom, acquired a small piece of land, and raised 9 children within a household of his own making, the hundreds of children conceived under compulsion remained largely strangers. Scattered across estates or distant provinces, their identities and connections largely erased by the system that created them. His life after emancipation illustrates the limits of liberation when social structures have so thoroughly undermined family and identity. Legal freedom could restore physical autonomy, but it could not reconstruct the intimate bonds that had been intentionally severed. Pataseka's descendants, living as living testaments to his existence, carry both the resilience of survival and the scars of a system that treated kinship as disposable, inheritance as property, and human lives as tools for production. In reflecting on Pataseka's story, the scale and intent of the systematic destruction of family become unmistakable. His experience provides a lens through which we can understand the deliberate strategies of slavery to erase identity, manipulate lineage, and fragment communities for economic gain. The hundreds of children he fathered highlight both the cruelty and the ingenuity of this system, where biological continuity was ensured at the expense of emotional connection and social cohesion. Through this lens, we recognize that Pataseka's life is not simply a tale of survival against brutal circumstances, but a profound illustration of how slavery operated to reshape human existence. Redefining family, identity, and legacy. His story serves as a reminder of the enduring consequences of these strategies, prompting us to consider the human costs that lie beneath historical records and the living echoes of a past where family ties were subordinated to profit and control. As the chains of slavery were finally lifted in Brazil with the passage of the Golden Law in 1888, Ro Jose Florencio, known to many as Pataseka, emerged into a world that promised freedom but could not erase decades of coerced labor, exploitation, and the fragmentation of his family. After a lifetime spent as a tool for profit, as a man whose body had been commandeered to ensure the continuation of a labor force, he finally received what had been denied to him for so long: the autonomy to make choices for himself, the right to cultivate a life of his own, and a small piece of land where he could exercise the freedoms that had been unimaginable during his years on the plantation. With this land, Pataseka began the painstaking process of carving out a new chapter for his life. A chapter defined not by the mandates of masters but by his own hands, his own decisions, and his own dreams. On this modest farm, he married a woman named Palmera, and together they raised 9 children, each born into a world where he could finally assume the role of fatherhood in the full human sense, offering care, guidance, and the intimacy that had been systematically denied to him for so long. These 9 children were a source of personal fulfillment and continuity, a tangible expression of Pataseka's life beyond the confines of slavery, and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He nurtured them, worked alongside them, and experienced the profound connections of family for the first time in his life. Yet even as he cultivated this small circle of kinship, the reality of the hundreds of other children he had been forced to sire remained an unhealable wound. Those children, spread across plantations and distant regions, carried his blood but not his presence, a stark reminder that freedom, while transformative, could not undo the deliberate fragmentation imposed by the institution of slavery. Pataseka's post-emancipation years illustrate the long-term human cost of a system designed to commodify reproduction. He lived to witness the profound changes in Brazilian society, the transition from a slave economy to a nation grappling with the legacies of bondage, the shifts in governance, and the slow evolution of rights and social structures. Yet even as he navigated these new realities, the echoes of slavery reverberated through every aspect of his personal life. His story is not only one of survival but also a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of systemic erasure. It highlights the enduring psychological and social consequences of slavery, where even the legal attainment of freedom could not restore the intimate human bonds that had been severed by decades of calculated exploitation. For his descendants and the communities connected to his lineage, Pataseka's life offers both a source of identity and a somber reflection on history. Oral traditions and genealogical studies reveal that significant portions of the population in certain districts of São Paulo can trace their ancestry back to him, a remarkable legacy that underscores both his prolific role under compulsion and the fragmented nature of family life under slavery. While these descendants inherit his resilience and genetic presence, they also inherit the story of loss, displacement, and the severing of ties that define generations of enslaved families. Pataseka's narrative bridges the past and present, reminding us that history is not only recorded in laws, documents, and economic data but also in the lives, relationships, and unhealed wounds of those who endured its consequences. His story teaches a powerful lesson about the capacity of human systems to inflict deep and lasting harm, and simultaneously about the strength of individuals who survive and rebuild. It demonstrates how institutionalized exploitation can shape not just the immediate victims, but the social and familial landscapes for generations to come. Yet it also affirms the enduring capacity for resilience, for creating meaning, and for reclaiming humanity in circumstances where so much had been taken. Pataseka, through his survival and the family he was finally able to nurture, embodies both the tragedy of a life constrained by oppression and the possibility of restoration through agency and perseverance. As we reflect on his life, we are compelled to confront the broader implications of slavery, not as a distant historical abstraction, but as a lived experience with tangible human consequences. Pataseka's journey from coerced breeder to landowner, husband, and father in freedom invites us to recognize the long shadow cast by systemic exploitation and the ongoing responsibility to remember, acknowledge, and learn from these histories. His story challenges us to see the humanity behind historical statistics and to understand that behind every number, every record, there were real people with aspirations, pain, and endurance. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Pataseka's story, a narrative that underscores both the horrors of slavery and the resilience of those who survived it. By exploring lives like his, we ensure that these histories are not forgotten and that the lessons they carry continue to resonate. If this story has moved you or expanded your understanding of history, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more untold narratives, and sharing it with others so that the memory of those who endured can continue to be honored.